Alright, looks like we're in. Okay, so school holidays are officially over. Start back studying today, so naturally, watch me procrastinate. Yeah, just trying to get some routine in and try to hit all the things I've sort of committed to trying to hit. Yeah, so welcome back to Storytime with me. We're reading Headhunters of the Amazon. By, who is it? F.W. Updegraff. Never remember his name. Yeah, I suppose we'll get on to chapter 14. Oh, come on, Sunlight, you're doing the thing. Yeah, chapter 14. Might as well start into it. So chapter 14, we start for unknown country. Our host's hospitality did not end at Branca. He insisted on our making use of the Onza for a further distance upstream, in fact, as far as the steamer could go. The canoes for our expedition, which had been towed up from Iquitos, were increased in number by another bought in Barranca, 3 in all. Probably not going to be able to keep rolling my R's for that, but we'll see how we go. And so we made our final start at dawn on the 11th day of our stop at Barranca. The Onza pointed her nose upstream, the first steamboat ever to navigate the waters of the Marañón above that station since the fall of Borja. The days of strenuous preparation were over. Days of struggling with ammunition cases, boxes of trade goods, and war bags. The latter is a name given in the western states to a prospector's kit bag. Ours were especially prepared to meet the local conditions. Amazon fashion, indeed, any camping party that had to face the possibility of floods, heavy rain, or overturning in river or lake would find this particular style of package invaluable. These bags are made by stretching linen over a flour barrel, or any similar object, sewing it up, and coating it with rubber milk drawn fresh from the tree. Several coats are put on, each in its turn being allowed to dry. The barrel is withdrawn, and a perfectly watertight cylindrical bag is the result. After stowing all the stores of a delicate nature which damp could harm, the neck of the bag is drawn together with the cord so tightly that no water could possibly enter. These bags, being flexible, vary from day to day in size according to the amount of kit they contain, and are therefore more handy than ever, as they never occupy more space than necessary, unlike a case or trunk. They can be thrown overboard when going downstream and towed. They can be left outside the tent all night in the rain to make room for beds. When packing is necessary, they fit the back and shoulders and thus ease the burden. In short, they are the most versatile form of luggage yet invented. 2 days of capybara hunting, lounging on the deck, impromptu concerts for the benefit of Don Juan Jose, and fuel chopping, brought us to the highest point which the Onza could make. It was during a halt for cutting fuel that we had our first disillusionment as to the prowess of the cook of the expedition, Ambusha. I took him off into the dense woods to have a look for game or anything else of interest. His assurances as to his knowledge of woodcraft had made a deep impression on the party. It remained only to see him in action. Well, he set off as hard as he could go, plunging into the thickets and apparently disdaining to mark his trail, forging ahead so fast, indeed, that it was all I could do to keep up with him. I began to wonder whether he realized that it was roughly 1,000 miles, in the direction in which we were making, before we could be clear of these woods, a like distance to the north before striking the Caribbean Sea, that the Andes lay to the west between us and the Pacific Ocean, and that some 3,000 miles of virgin forest, rivers, and swamps awaited us to the east, before we could gaze on the Atlantic. To lose oneself in this, nature's greatest labyrinth on earth, was not a prospect which appealed to me. My experiences on the upper Yasuni, of which I've already spoken, had been enough to leave a vivid impression of the folly of placing too much confidence in a newcomer. On reaching a well-marked tapir trail, my suspicions were confirmed dramatically enough. Ambusha fell on his knees, examining the tracks with an expert eye, smelled them, licked his fingers, and felt them. This last was one too many for me, and announced solemnly that a war party of Indians with women, probably captives, had made along that way, going west, passing above the Pongo within the last month. The shock was certainly great, but not too great to prevent me from asking him whether he could tell anything about their religion or morals. After this, I cut my own trail. This precaution saved us both from the destruction to which Ambusha would have led me. He attempted to dispute the way back, but I noticed that he took care to trail me within sight and hearing, while I made my own way to the boat. As I say, at the end of the second day, we had made the highest point to which the Onza could go. The current had become so swift that no further progress was possible. The steamer was labouring hard and making practically no headway. So we drew into a sandbar on the left bank of the river and dropped anchor. We cleared out, bag and baggage, untied the canoes and beached them, and, after giving our host a send-off with cheers and rifle shots, we set to work to build a temporary baggage shelter. 2 men working for an hour can make a first-class waterproof thatched hut, 15 feet by 20, with the aid of the enormous palm leaves of endless varieties which are to be found everywhere. A slanting roof made of many thicknesses of palm is supported by bamboo poles driven into the ground. But elsewhere, I shall go into further detail as to the building of these houses. Our first evening was passed in contentment and rest. My journal describes the scene. June 29th, 1899. We have decided not to do guard duty until we reach the Pongo, as the savages are rarely seen below that point. Everyone is smoking, and Ed is playing his banjo. All well and in the best of spirits. Here we passed 5 days, hunting to keep the larder full, and waiting for the water to fall, so that we could make the passage of the Pongo. On the 30th, the river was still rising, and we had to withdraw to the main bank, some 4 feet higher than the sandbar. We made false bottoms for our canoes to keep the cargo out of the bilge water, and palm leaf covers, armariaris, to protect it from sun and rain. I shot a big parrot, the first meat captured on the expedition. This was a macaw, or as the Indians say, huacamayo, as large as a chicken, and the possessor of beautiful blue, red, and yellow plumage. The ants were beginning to harry us, and we had a few showers to damp the enthusiasm of the tenderfoot members of the party. Hunting was good. Monkeys, turkeys, and pohillas falling to our guns. One night, I brought in 4 monkeys, which we roasted for supper. We discovered, by the way, that the meat is not the only edible portion of these animals. Yet we're talking about monkeys. Oh God. We discovered, by the way, that the meat is not the only edible portion of these animals. The brains are acceptable, by way of a change. I can just hear my dad saying it's too close to cannibalism. Where are we? On July 2nd, a Monday, the river fell 6 feet, and we reckoned that a start would be possible on the 4th, which indeed we made. We opened a barrel of rum to celebrate our attack on the Pongo, and were off in high spirits at 10 a.m. Sleeping on a sandbar in the open that night, with the sole protection of mosquito bars suspended from the canoe poles stuck in the sand, we had the luck to strike a fair sky. Here, we started to go on guard duty, Ed and I taking the first watch, it being commonly agreed that all would sleep more soundly if this precaution were taken. One of the most remarkable kills which we made during the whole expedition was made there. A snow-white alligator, measuring from about 5 feet in length, was shot by Jack and prepared for supper. Some were a bit shy about trying it at first, but all voted it the best meat on the trip to date. It was perfectly white and tasted very much like chicken. The skin was left to the kites and buzzards on the sand. It was impossible at this stage, the first of a 2-year trip, to start preserving skins and packing them round with us. Whether this was some freak of nature, an albino perhaps, I do not know, but certain it is that I have never come across a similar reptile in any other place, nor heard of one. It was not an iguana, which is so different in appearance as to make it impossible to confuse the two. The formation of the jaws and teeth left no doubt as to it being an alligator. Of our progress from this point to within sight of Borja and the Pongo de Manseriche, I cannot do better than quote from the notes I made at the time. Starting at sunrise, we paddled and pulled till noon, when we rested and ate hardtack, roast alligator, the remains of the white one, farinha, a kind of tapioca made from arrowroot and one of the staple foods of Brazil, and molasses. We lost 2 dogs, which jumped overboard and disappeared into the forest, and were probably killed by jaguars. The river is becoming narrower, and mud bars and banks are giving place to sand and gravel. The water is becoming much clearer and colder. The foothills of the Andes are continuously in sight, and appear to be only 10 or 15 miles away. The actual distance must have been about 50. The green hands are becoming more skillful with pole and paddle. Of the art of manipulating a canoe in swift water, I speak elsewhere. A moment's reflection will enable the reader to understand how it came about that we had to leave a portion of the cargo of the Exploradora, the big dugout, caching it on Mataya Isla, an island we named thus on account of the abundance of game. The swiftness of the current and the presence of old trees whose roots had caught in the bed of the stream made the steering of a fully laden craft, with a freeboard of only 3 or 4 inches, a risky game. One day we shot a lumbuki, a toucan. In accordance with the Indian custom, we looked for the worm in its eye, and, what is more interesting, immediately found it. All our efforts to persuade Jack to put it in his own, so that he would have better luck when next out hunting, failed. Indeed, there was no candidate for the privilege. So we finally put it in one of the dog's eyes, in the hope that he would keep watch a little better. Greatly to our disappointment, he barked at everything from ants to moonshine, and the next day he too was carried off by a jaguar within 100 yards of camp. Not a day passed without its own tragedy or comedy, or both. Mataya Isla, where we were now camped, was, as I have said, teeming with game. We had arrived on July the 8th, and the rising of the water once more delayed our progress. Moreover, 1 or 2 of the party were feeling the strain of the hard poling and paddling of the last few days. The island must have been connected with the mainland at low water. It was about 3 miles long by half a mile broad. No palms grew on it, the only vegetation from which we could make shelters being the wild cane, like sugar cane in appearance, growing to a height of 20 feet. This afforded poor shelter from the rain, though it cast a good enough shadow. Often, as a consequence, we had recourse to the canoes. Wrapping ourselves in our blankets, we would creep under the shelter of the palm leaf covers we had made some days before, for it rained as often as not. But mosquitoes were even more plentiful than game. There were, broadly speaking, 2 varieties, the day shift and the night shift. For those on guard at night, they made life unbearable. Smoke was useless as a protection against them. When it rained, we stripped to keep our clothes dry. What with the cold water, the proximity of the snow-capped Andes kept the rain at an unpleasantly low temperature. The choking smoke, we had to sit near the fire for warmth, and the attentions of the zancudos, the long-shanked ones in Spanish. The night passed slowly, sent on their way to the accompaniment of some frank remarks on life in general, and the Amazon in particular. I see on reference to my journal that Ambusha remains always near camp and never misses a chance of a drink of rum, and is always punctual at mealtimes. When he is not occupied with cleaning his rifle, he is busy reading up anarchism. By this time, we had come to a unanimous decision to relieve Ambusha of his culinary duties. He might have been more proficient in the mixing of poisons, in which he claimed to be an expert. From this time forward, therefore, the cooking was done by watches. The 11th of July was a red-letter day. On that date, Morse discovered some turtle's eggs and brought nearly 200 back to camp. On the expedition, he proved to be the expert of this important branch of foraging for the larder. We named him the Turtle Hound, and he was proud of the title. I will take this opportunity of saying something about these reptiles, which constitute the most sought after, and at the same time the most abundant food of the inhabitants of the Amazon waterways, both white and brown. There are 4 main varieties. The charapa, the largest, weighs on an average 75 pounds and deposits from 50 to 150 eggs, slightly smaller than a hen's, in a single night. The Jivaros call these eggs Shajap. It's like CHA accent JAP. I don't even, no idea how to do a Jivaro accent, I guess. Oh, there's someone watching. Hello. On my phone, so I can't actually see chat running, but hi. Needless to say, if an attempt were made to put so many eggs back into the shell of the reptile which laid them, it would be necessary to cut the whole of the flesh away in order to make room for them. This is a miracle of production which, I think, is not surpassed in the animal world, except by certain insects. The second inside is known as a tarikaya in the Quichua tongue. It weighs about 20 pounds and deposits some 20 or 30 eggs, half the size of a hen's and oval in shape, in one night. The yambu, in Quichua, is smaller still. It weighs 8 to 10 pounds and lays about 10 eggs at a time, of the same shape as those of the tarakaya, but smaller. The last of the edible turtles is the land tortoise. I have found these of all sizes, from 6 to 18 inches in length. The meat, and the soup which is made from it, seems to be as good as any in the world, all 4 varieties being equally appetizing. The eggs are odorless and similar to a fresh hen's egg, with the exception that the white is not quite so albuminous. They are very nutritious, can be prepared in any way in which the latter can, and, as I know from experience on the Amazon, when there is no other food to be found, they keep a man healthy and strong for weeks at a time. The shell is brittle during the first 24 hours of incubation, but not afterwards. The most appetizing form in which they can be cooked is the sweet omelette. Broken raw and beaten up with rum and sugar, they make a very fine eggnog. I held the record with 40 taken at one sitting in this form. Finally, they can be eaten at any stage of incubation, and are just as good on the day before the young breaks the shell as on the day when they are laid. Yum. The turtles came ashore at night, looking about them with the greatest care. Their senses must be very keen, and they are shy to a degree. The slightest noise or movement drives them back into the water, where they are more at home than on dry land. They are indeed seldom out of the water, except on the one night in the year when they emerge to deposit their eggs in the sand. They waddle up the sandbars, leaving a double track made by their feet on either side of the shell. The result is a miniature wagon trail, which clearly indicates the size of the turtle, and consequently, the number of eggs that may be expected. Following their trail until one comes to a point where it is broken and indistinct, the sand is tested with the heel or pointed stick, when the nests are easily discovered. The turtles take great care to bury their eggs and to leave little trace of their presence. If rain has fallen 2 or 3 times since the tracks were made, it is very difficult to find them at all. Man is not the only animal which hunts for these delicacies. The jaguars are very fond of them, and the results of their feasts are often found in the shape of eggshells lying about in the midst of the unmistakable footprints of these beasts. When hungry, they even attack the turtles themselves and scoop the meat out of their shells. A curious fact about these reptiles is that the young, from the very moment when they break the shell, are endowed with an unerring instinct which leads them, always under cover of darkness, straight to the river, even though there may be a rise in the ground which prevents them from seeing or hearing it. They may be a quarter of a mile away when they emerge from the sand where they were hatched, but they never hesitate. Nor do they ever break cover except at night. Otherwise they would be exposed to great danger, if not from birds of prey, then from the sand, which would scorch their limbs before they could reach the water. Hadn't thought of the sand thing. I once saw a practical demonstration of the fate which would overcome them if they came out by day, having disturbed, during an egg hunt, a nestful which had been hatched out, and which would shortly have broken cover. The yolk of the egg, which remains attached to the underside of the young reptile's shells, and from which they derive their nourishment while gathering strength to break and run for the river, was in this case practically consumed, so that the turtles had enough strength to reach the river, had it not been that they were unearthed by me in the daytime. Once discovered, there is nothing for it but to attempt to get to the water, which they started to do, streaming off more like a stampede of gigantic bedbugs than anything else. Before covering 10 yards, their legs shriveled up. They turned red as if cooked on the fire and immediately died. No. We found sandbars 2 or 3 miles in length and hundreds of yards broad, in which the eggs were so thickly strewn that it was practically impossible to dig without finding them. Considering that the rivers in that country are lined with a succession of these sandbanks at low water, it was a source of constant wonder to us that with such teeming millions of eggs, so few turtles, comparatively speaking, were to be seen. If only half the young reached the water, there would be no room for them. And yet, such is the perfection of this natural system of incubation that we never found a single bad egg in any nest. The jaguars cannot possibly account for more than a minute proportion of the total number of young. Indeed, the cause of their destruction must lie in the water, for that the vast majority reach it is certain. It would seem improbable that the old turtles themselves eat the young, for in all those that we cut open, we never found traces of anything but vegetable matter. Life is exceedingly persistent in these reptiles. The head, after being separated from the body for hours, will bite with as much force as when alive, and the legs, if touched after being removed from the body for a similar length of time, will move vigorously. I've even cut a turtle's heart into 12 strips and watched each continuing to beat for some minutes. In fact, until the sun dried them up when we exposed them, with the regularity of the whole organ during life. A potful of pieces of turtle put on to cook in cold water will force themselves out by the post-mortem muscular activity, which refuses to cease until the water reaches a temperature sufficient to stiffen them. That's horrific. That's fucking awful. Poor turtles. I like those guys. July 12th. Game, who has been ailing for the past few days, has broken out all over his body with measles or smallpox, we don't know which. He travels in the bow of the Exploradora, covered by the palm leaf canoe tops which shield him from the burning sun and frequent showers. He is delirious most of the time. This was our first experience of sickness. Fortunately, he recovered within 10 days, and no one else was infected. It turned out not to be smallpox. My journal records an amusing and instructive incident under the same date. Jack and Ed went out last night to watch for turtles. They fell asleep, and while they dreamed, the turtles deposited their eggs all about them within a few feet, one having actually crawled over Jack's legs, which was proved by the tracks next morning. They brought back several hundred eggs, but no turtles. It was a remarkable thing that they should have ventured so near to the men. The turtle is one of the most cunning and sly creatures, possessed of a very sharp pair of eyes and apparently of a sense of hearing second to none. I say apparently, for it has been demonstrated by Darwin that the giant land tortoise of the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador are stone deaf. On the morning of July 16th, we had broken camp at dawn, stowed our kit in the canoes, and were sitting round the fire sipping our coffee, munching hardtack and turtles' eggs, our regulation breakfast, and fighting off sandflies. Suddenly, just as we were about to embark, Ed caught sight of a huge sacha-huagra, the Quechua name meaning a large beast of the forest. For the tapir, or danta, is, as the Peruvians say, sorry, that's a horrible sentence. Suddenly, as we were about to embark, Ed caught sight of a huge sacha-huagra, the Quechua name meaning a large beast of the forest. For the tapir, or danta, is the Peruvians say, the largest pachyderm of the Amazon woods. So it's all brackets and commas and apostrophes there. So we caught sight of that guy swimming the river some 500 yards above where we were and making for our island. Jack was the only man who had his gun ready, which is fortunate for us, for he was the big game hunter of the party and a crack shot. He raced off to get a shot at the animal, and shortly afterwards we heard him fire once. On his return, we greeted him with, "So he got away from you, did he?" "Yeah, for about 50 yards, came the answer. Jack was a man of few words, but they were generally to the point. So we all went off, 8 of us, with tackle to drag the beast to the water. It must have weighed 600 pounds, for it was all we could do to drag it 100 yards. Once in the water, I got astride it with a paddle, and floated it down to camp. We set to work to cut it up, and for many days it provided excellent meat, very similar to beef in appearance and taste. We cured it, of course, in the smoke of our fire. The feet and the snout were the great delicacies. Wouldn't have called it. These beasts are 3-toed on the forefeet and 4-toed on the hind feet, like the rhinoceros, the general formation of the head being similar to that of the latter, but for the absence of horns on the long snout. For the whole of the 16th of July we were busy dealing with the tapir, finishing up at night with the first-rate feast off the meat. We built a specially large fire, there was no trouble on that island in finding driftwood for fuel, and roasted the ribs, standing them up before the fire and sheltering from the heat behind them. They formed a wall some 2 feet 6 high. The animal was in fine condition, and that supper stands out in my memory as one of the best we ever had. There are times when a good square meal becomes an impressive event. For the next 3 days, we struggled on upstream, fighting against ever-increasingly hard conditions. The channel was becoming narrower, and the current consequently swifter. Often, we pulled ourselves along with the help of overhanging branches. Sometimes we pulled, at other times we had a hard stretch of paddling to cross, from one bank to the other, a distance of some 300 or 400 yards at this point, and yet again, we would be obliged to abandon all forms of propulsion and drag the canoe with ropes made of the tapir's skin. One day, we were in the water all day long. Meanwhile, Ed, Pedro, and the boy had been left behind on Matea Isla with some of the stores. Ed was suffering from a strained back. Pedro had had a foot crushed by the big canoe, and the boy was left to do the heavy work for them. As for the rest of us, we were beginning to feel the effect of being in the water all day, irregular diet, and the abrupt changes from sun to cold rain. However, the thought of the proximity of our goal urged us to constant effort, and on the 18th, we arrived within sight of that superb outlet for the full volume of the waters of the Marañón, the Santiago, and 100 tributary streams, called the Pongo de Manseriche. We have just made camp on the point of an island exactly facing the Pongo, into which the sun is setting at this moment. The playa, foreshore, is littered with our wet clothing and beds. The fire is burning and the pot is on. Ambusha is grinding coffee, Jack is fondling his gold pan, and Game is squatting by the edge of the water, sharpening his machete. The scene here is magnificent. Behind us is a dense bamboo thicket, impenetrable by man or beast, and on the other side of the point on which we have pitched camp, there are 300 yards of swift water, which gives us a feeling of perfect security against surprise. Just in front of us are the foothills of the Andes, the nearest through which the Pongo is cut, being less than a mile distant. Above and beyond stretch the heights, until in the distance may be described the crowning peaks whose faint blue melts into the sky. There, on those very heights, once stood the monumental cities of the Inca civilization, which towered supreme above the savage races of the South American continent. You can picture the scene, Ambusha on his knees in the bottom of a canoe, rubbing the coffee for the evening meal on his flat poop with a heavy stone. Jack growling about that last monkey gut that I had prepared for the G-string of his banjo, and humming to himself intermittently the air of the ditty to which he was to treat us that evening, some new invention of his fertile brain. Game hoping to cut his way into that bamboo thicket and stop the infernal screeching of the macaws which made life hideous. Eurico, working on a new shirt, he was a great tailor and had brought with him a roll of cloth, and I myself, squatting by the fire, confronted by the sizzling of the pots and the last rays of the sun, scrawling the lines I quote above. Contentment possessed our souls. We were resting on our laurels after a hard struggle, and there lay the Pongo just ahead, with its secrets to be probed. And the mosquitoes! Gone! Gone forever until the day when we should be returning to civilization laden with our spoils, for all stagnant water had been left behind in the flat country, and with it the greatest part of the Amazon, the greatest pest of the Amazon, the ever-hungry mosquito. All around us was a scene of great beauty. Behind us, the forest stretching away interminably, and ahead, due west, the Pongo. I will resort once more to my journal for a note as to how it appeared to us from the camp. Looking at it as we do from the side, it more resembles a water gap than a canyon. At least, the shoulder of the nearest ridge appears to slope away at about 45 degrees. The reason for this misconception of the formation of the canyon, it really is a canyon, lay in the fact that the view was not directly into its mouth, but about at right angles to it. Thus, we were merely looking across the top of one of the jaws. Incidentally, the spurs which form the northern and southern jaws, so to speak, would not make a continuous ridge if the mouth were filled in, but would overlap, or to use a military term which expresses the idea concisely, they are in echelon, the one which comes from the north being some 30 yards east of the one which comes from the south. This same formation continues as one pushes further on through the canyon, towards the west, and the result being a gigantic serpent with many twists and turns. Some awful sentences to read here. Right. Next day, July 19th, we broke camp at dawn, eager to forge ahead. We pushed off from what proved to be the last playa before arriving on the site of Borja. It is perhaps worth mentioning that camping on the sandbars is infinitely preferable to penetrating into the woods. In the latter case, a small clearing must be cut, the ground scraped clear of the old leaf mold which teems with insect life, and a strong roof built to protect the occupants of the shelter from being hurt by falling deadwood, cast down by the troops of night monkeys, tutacuchillos, which in Quechua means a rambler by night, in their passage through the trees, or by one of the windstorms which arise, particularly in the dry season, with startling rapidity. Lastly, and perhaps this is the most important consideration in countries such as that we had now reached, there is the constant fear of night attack by savages, whose presence no white man can be confident of discovering until they are within a few feet of the camp. Winding upstream the whole of that memorable day, we arrived at Borja, or rather, what used to be Borja, in the early afternoon. To any but experienced eyes, the immense clearing where the town had stood differed in no respect from the primeval forest surrounding it. Indeed, the jungle was so thick that we abandoned our first idea of pitching camp on this site, and crossed to the south bank where we finally settled. Clearing a small space on the bank itself, there was no playa, unfortunately, we put up a thatched roof as usual, and stowed our kit. Crossing again to the opposite bank that same evening in our anxiety to see what traces still existed of the town of Borja, we landed among the gigantic limestone boulders, at a distance of not more than 200 yards from the very mouth of the Pongo, now revealed in its true form. The site of Borja had been chosen in about the year 1865 by the Peruvian government as a suitable spot for the building of what was meant to be the home of an agricultural colony, and a place from which the Peruvian flag could be flown. Thus, the Peruvian title to the naturally rich but unmapped country between that point and Barranca would be undisputed, the same spot having once been occupied, according to Condamine, by Ecuadorian missionaries. It should be understood, a fact that a native of a wholly civilized country will find it hard to realize, that the frontiers of Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia, adjacent to and in the Amazon district, many thousands of miles in length, are purely imaginary. On the best modern atlases, you will find, as often as not, that great tracts of this region are marked unexplored. The boundaries of the countries mentioned vary in accordance with the origin of the map. A Brazilian map will show Brazil to embrace immense territories which, on a Peruvian map, belong to Peru, and so on ad infinitum. An American, by the name of Wolfe, once prepared a map for the Ecuadorian government and drew his pencil round a large tract of country east of the Andes, which is claimed by several other states, painting it green, the usual color of Ecuador. He met with a great reception at the hands of the Cortes. This was the map, a copy of which was presented to me by the President of Ecuador in person, Senor Eloy Alfaro, when I originally set out from Quito. Probably the real solution of this vexed problem will only be arrived at when some enterprising foreigner finds pay dirt or some other valuable product in that unknown land and starts a stampede for the new El Dorado. Then, through recourse to arms, in which the savage tribes will probably play no small part, the interested countries will fight the question out. Each in turn will endeavor to obtain the support of the Jivaros, supplying them with firearms and boatloads of junk, and then, in turn, will be betrayed by them. After years of bloodshed and intrigue, the savage native, who has been trained and bribed by each white combatant in turn, will turn on his white brother and drive him out, because of the great gulf that is fixed between them. No comparison can be drawn between the difficulties of any campaign of a similar nature, yet known to history, and those which would have to be faced by an invading army in these interminable swamps. The attempt to found a colony of Borgia, starting under the most favourable auspices, failed dismally. Men were found who were ready to embark with their families for this new Garden of Eden. Transport was provided in the shape of river steamers, which were to be run on a regular 6-monthly service, to continue to furnish them with food and necessities after they had built their new homes, until such time as their crops matured. At the commencement, the enterprise was successful. The foundations of the town were laid, the first houses built, and the first crops planted. At the end of 6 months, the steamer arrived to find a flourishing little community of some 100 souls. But that was the last chapter of the known history of Borgia. The next boat turned the last bend in the river, to be faced by empty ruins and wood-choked clearings. The Huambisas from above the Pongo had paid them a visit. The site had been remarkably well chosen, and we could see when we landed. The great boulders of which I have spoken formed a natural breakwater which prevented the erosion of the bank. Through the centre of the settlement ran a delightful mountain stream of crystal water. There was a good landing place at the edge of the town, with deep, quiet water for a steamboat to lie at anchor. As we chopped and hacked our way through into the town, we were surprised to see numbers of limes and orange trees, the former still bearing good fruit. No traces of houses were to be seen, however, except here and there orderly piles of earthenware dishes and pots showing where they had stood, and an occasional hardwood post still standing, one more proof of the enduring quality of this material. A solitary stone handmill, for the grinding of corn supposedly, was the only other relic of civilization which had survived the 35 years' ravages of the tropical climate. And so we stood and surveyed the scene, the first white men, as far as I know, to penetrate to the site of that dismal page of Peruvian history since the disconsolate skipper of the steamboat which was to bring back the news to Iquitos turned the nose of his command downstream. Whew, that was about 15 minutes longer than I thought it might be, but there we go. That is chapter 14. Cheers to whoever's watching this. I don't know if I have the ability to look at the chat from here. Welcome to live chat. Remember to guard your privacy. And it says welcome. I don't really see where it provides it, but yeah, cool. Anyway, I should probably get some work done. Yeah, stoked. That's 2 weeks in a row I've got this out now. On a roll. We've got still this much to go. Yeah, nearly there. Something like that. Ooh, movement. Alright, lovies and levies. Cheers for watching. Hopefully see you next Sunday. How do we make this stop? Ooh, that is a good question.